Good morning, everyone. He doesn't wear a tie either. So, thank you very much to Joe and all the team again for the invitation to speak here again today. I'm always worried when I come and speak at an event, as I did last year, and it's an event I enjoy coming to, that I might not get re-invited back again. So at least this is two goes at it. Hopefully I won't say anything today to ruin next year, because it's always a pleasure to come to Donegal. Last year, of course, I had the great advantage of a large announcement to make about re-entering the bond market. So in case anybody thinks that I have another thing up my sleeve today, I don't. We're just going to have to talk about the topic that we're going to talk about. And I suppose in terms of the debate that's going on, that has been in many ways sort of consuming the national debate over the last couple of years, I was flicking through some stuff recently, and I think it's probably worth pointing out that this is not a new debate for Ireland. And I think when you come to a school like this and you talk about stuff, it allows us to look as well at other countries, but also to look back in the past. And I wanted to just quote briefly from a minister's speech from the 1929 budget, and I'm sure, like all ministers, the speech had nothing to do with what the Department of Finance wanted him to say, but it was written by himself as a minister. But Minister Blythe in 1929 said that good national credit is practically essential to the growth of industry through private enterprise, because in its absence there cannot be stability and continuity of financial policy, or any certainty that the state will not be driven by dire need to resort to the imposition of unforeseen and arbitrary burdens. And he went on to say that instead of too freely seeking loans, we have pursued a distinctively conservative financial policy and have kept the deadweight burden of national debt down to a figure which, considering all the circumstances of the past few years, is astonishingly low. And for those of you who are kind of familiar with that period, or indeed those who are not, it's worth remembering that despite that type of a policy, those were exactly the same years that the state embarked in one of the most ambitious projects of investment down in the Shannon scheme in Ardnacrusha. And so it was actually possible, even back then, to try and marry the concept of fiscal contraction and managing budget deficits with, in fact, investment into the future. And of course, it's a very delicate balance that we go through all the time. Working out, governments that have surpluses don't really need to worry too much about this type of thing. Governments that are running deficits need to be constantly watching where they can raise the cash from to allow them to, in fact, keep up the exercise of managing a deficit reduction in a pace that they feel comfortable with. And of course, as we know, back in 2010, the markets effectively shut off to the Irish government the ability to choose how they wanted to do that. And they had to sort of resort to external things and remind ourselves where we were at that stage. And it's not that long ago, but we had an economy in total free fall. Unemployment was rising very high. We were losing about 6,000 jobs a month. The banks, and Fiona's going to talk about that more, were losing 60 billion of deposits over a period in the run-up to the bailout. And the underlying primary balance that we had in Ireland was over 9%. So effectively, we found ourselves shut off. And of course, what I've heard an awful lot of sense is people saying, yeah, but this was all the banks. If we hadn't the problem with the banks, then we wouldn't actually have had any problem at all. And I think it's one of the regrets that one of the much under-discussed facts that I hear in the commentary is the fact that over half of the debt that we've accumulated through this period is actually not anywhere related to banks at all. It comes from the fact that we have been running large underlying primary deficits every year since 2008. And I think that's a very important part of analysis that we need to keep in mind all the time. Now, at the same time, we can ask, why are we running these deficits? And we can see, in effect, two major causes. The first is what I refer to as a causal sort of impact, which is that we had, in the previous years running up to the crisis, been overly reliant on, in effect, transitory sources of property-driven revenue, which, of course, when they disappeared, you cannot suddenly restructure your tax system overnight to do that, and inevitably that takes a little bit of time. The second thing, however, though, was a reaction to the situation in which we were in, and a decision that we shouldn't just suddenly stop spending money more than we were earning, but rather we should continue to go through an exercise of running deficits so we could support the people that needed help, particularly those that were losing jobs, so that we could continue to provide, albeit on a reducing basis, public services and not have the drastic cuts that we've seen in other countries where they've been imposed, and also continue, albeit reduced, but nonetheless a capital expenditure programme. So there were some real decisions around that. But when I came back in 2010 to Ireland, frankly, since then, if you heard about it, you would think that somebody had decided to suddenly stop running deficits all of a sudden in terms of government decisions. And that has not, of course, been the case. Automatic stabilisers have, in fact, been allowed to run through the process of recovery. But then, of course, we came to 2010. And in many ways, what was essentially happening, and this is a key part back in 2009, it was a key part back in 2010, even today it's a key issue, which is what were our funders saying about our choices? And the markets were essentially saying in 2010, we do not want you to continue on this, we are not going to support you on this journey to recovery. And it is impossible to do this journey of recovery without funding if you're running deficits, because somebody needs to provide money to actually keep the lights on. And therefore, we had a situation where we had to kind of go through a Troika programme, and it inevitably came with conditions and a discussion between the government and the Troika as to how we would do it. And of course, the problem is that these choices are not easy. Nothing is easy in this process. There has been an awful lot of pain, and in fact the important thing I keep saying is that it's not just a question of the pain in terms of the averages and everything else. We have to also keep in mind the individual pain and what in fact is going on in households behind the average statistics, which is a very important thing for us to keep in mind. But at the same time, I don't think we had any choice. If you look at what the ESRI study has recently said, had we continued just on the path we were on without any of the reform, we would be looking today at a debt that's 16 percentage points higher than we actually have, and a deficit that's 6 percentage points higher. Now, that sort of sounds fine and big and it's just numbers, but in real terms, bearing in mind that we're facing to budgets every year where we look at issues that cost tens of millions, had we continued on that path without actually reforming, without managing to reduce the debt, today we would be faced with an interest cost bill that's over $1 billion more than we currently have if we were able to borrow at today's rates. And I would suggest that we wouldn't be able to borrow at today's rates had we continued in that. And if we just applied the rates that we would have had at the time of the Troika, we would actually be looking in this budget for another $2 billion to actually pay the interest that we would have on that excess of debt. And I think you can see that with that we actually need to find a way to go through this delicate balancing act and figure out how to do it, but at the same time to do it in a way that minimises the interest cost to us of making those choices, of running those deficits. And it's a delicate balance, and I suppose it's no surprise that since we got through the promissory note discussions at the beginning of during the course of February, I've often asked, what are we going to do in the next budget? What are we going to do now that we have this promissory note deal that we've done, and that has an impact? And I said it back in February, and I will repeat it again today. I don't think we can say what the answer is today. It's premature to guess today what we should do in October. David made reference to the fact that this budget is already a tough one for us to do because we're doing it in October before we have the final numbers for the year. And to try and guess that today is impossible in terms of things. We know, people may know that we are expecting in September some very important numbers about the economy that tell us what the economy has been doing in the first half of the year and for allow us to guess what's going to happen in the second half of the year. And I think we need to have those to be able to make those decisions. But I think nonetheless it is very important, and I would like to kind of reiterate this, that we remain committed to the targets that we have in the programme in terms of where we're going to go. And I guess those of you that are out there will know that the recent CSO figures, which talked about the growth levels and the reduction in growth levels in terms of expectations, have made that job even more difficult. But at the same time, I think we need to just wait and see what the numbers are before we start making decisions about where we go on our budget. Now, that said, at the moment we've been very successful. We've seen the markets come back. So now, in fact, what is good is that going into the end of the year, we now have some choices. We can actually sort of, look at having market funding instead of necessarily going back to Troika funding for the end of the year in terms of deciding what we're going to do out into the future, and I want to come to that. We've rebuilt the trust of the markets, we've rebuilt the trust of our external partners, and trust has given us benefits. We've managed to renegotiate the interest rates, we've done the maturities, and we've done the promissory note, and so we're seeing a real benefit from the fact that we've rebuilt this trust for Ireland in terms of where we're going. And so what does that mean going forward? And I think that that's a more useful discussion in terms of having a discussion today about what we actually should be doing out over the next couple of years. To me, it's clear we need to reduce our debt burden. We have got an interest cost at the moment of about over 8 billion a year, which is a huge drain on our ability to actually manage the economy. So it's clear we need to work on bringing down the debt. How do you do that? Well, I guess it's no secret. You can look through sort of, people who've done this successfully in the past, and you'll see that we need to have measures that are structural measures, that are long-term measures, not just some quick fixes. We also need to get growth into the economy. So we need a policy mix that supports growth as we go through the next couple of years. We have to remember Ireland has to worry about the external environment, and I'll come back to that again. We can't do that without reference to what's going on in the rest of the world. And equally importantly, I don't think we can do it on our own. We need to have an environment that encourages private sector involvement in the rebuilding of the economy. The structural reform ones, I think, is sort of, everybody knows. We've seen the discussions around the Troika programme and the measures we've been taking, how we've been trying to make sure that these are long-term structural measures in terms of fixing the economy for the longer term. On growth, I guess, one thing I'd like to lay to rest, because I often get sort of, again, this question. Neither I nor my team in the department are under any illusions about the impact on growth of the measures we're taking. But at the same time, we don't believe that we can continue on an unsustainable path of just piling on debt on debt. So we have to do something. We have to do that in the context of remembering that Ireland is an open economy. That means that if you actually try and invest in the economy, I think everybody knows that exports in Ireland are over 100%, but not everybody's carrying around the opposite side of things, that our import numbers are 80% of GDP. Sorry, of GDP, not of debt there in terms of the statistic. And that means that every time you try and put money into the economy, there is a leakage of the money that you put into the economy in terms of the way our economy works. And therefore you have to be careful that the analysis that we apply to this is not just the analysis that applies to large economies that are somewhat closed. It has to be the analysis that applies to an economic unit like Ireland, which is actually very open. The other thing that I think is critically important is we will not be able to come out of this in some sort of isolation. We have to take account of the external environment. We have to take account of what is actually happening in our trading partners. And the fundamental point for me is that a strong Ireland needs a strong Europe. And without that, we're not going to be able to face into the future. And it's together with Europe that we want to plan the recovery of the economy here in Ireland. I referred to history, and I think it's probably one of the great sort of, accepted principles of Ireland, that we have discarded the idea of isolationism. And we are very much, in terms of planning for the future, integrating Ireland into a Europe. And that said, I think we would all agree that we'd prefer Europe to do its reforms more quickly than perhaps it's doing. But I think we have seen through the presidency around banking union, around everything else, a huge amount of progress in Europe. And more importantly, and this is a point that I want to iterate, the amount of effort that Europe is putting and the amount of firepower that Europe is putting towards solving the crisis is multiples of the size of our problems. And I think we sometimes forget that. The 960 billion MFF, or multi-annual framework, financial framework, is a tool for investment and growth, not over there on continental Europe, but throughout Europe. And we have to take advantage and to use that and work out how to use it. There's 8 billion of funds in the European budget dedicated to sorting out youth employment and 70 billion for research and development. Numbers that make our own budgetary exercise pale into almost into really small numbers by relative terms. And I think one of the other things that's forgotten about and is starting now, I think, to show fruit is the European Investment Bank and the role that that can play in terms of our own recovery. Relatively recently, I was appointed by the Minister to sit on the board of the European Investment Bank. And what the European Investment Bank is essentially our development bank. It's not a development bank for Spain or for France or for Italy. It's a development bank for all of the countries of Europe, including Ireland. And funding is a key to economic activity. And what the European Investment Bank brings us is actually the ability to fund our own economic activities at a rate that we can't do ourselves, because we're not a AAA country and we need to do more. And it is working. In 2010, EIB lending was about 250 million. Last year it was over 500 million, and this year alone it's over 590 million in the first 7 months of the year. Last board meeting we approved a loan for the University of Limerick, we approved a loan for a private company that's actually doing infrastructural development, and we did some stuff about how the European Investment Bank can support exporters in terms of getting credit. But again, the point is to think in relative terms, because at the same meeting, while we approved about 200 million of loans to Ireland, we approved over 15 billion of loans for the rest of Europe. And so the question we need to keep asking ourselves is are we using that properly? The other thing we have to do is make sure that we are actually properly supporting private sector investment in the economy. We've seen some very significant improvements as confidence in Ireland comes back, with external people coming in to actually support. The interesting thing about the reference I made at the beginning was at the time there was a big debate about whether we should allow foreign investment to help with the construction of Ardnacrusha. And I think we have to. It worked then, it continues to work now. We've seen Great West Life coming in to buy Irish Life and getting that off the hands of the state, freeing up our resources and actually adding capital to a life company. We see huge amounts of investment now by relative terms coming back into real estate investments, and issues like REITs and the stuff like that we can tweak, I think are important in terms of how we go there. But what we need to do is we need to actually find out and work through the economy sector by sector. I made reference to this briefly last year, and we really have kicked that off now over the last couple of weeks, is Minister Noonan and Minister Howland got the government to agree with the idea of developing a medium-term strategy out to 2020. Which I have the pleasure of trying to head off for a little bit of holiday tomorrow, but I can assure you there are officials in the department, one group working on the budget and the other group working with their colleagues across the whole of government throughout August on developing a medium-term economic plan. So that we won't go into this budget without having a sense of what we think the longer-term choices are, particularly the choices we need to make after the Troika exit. And the way we're going to do this is effectively to take those sectors of the economy, construction being an obvious example where we started already, that are broken and fix them. And take those other sectors of the economy that are not reaching their potential and try and find out what we can do to actually get their potential. And then overlay that with the sort of the horizontals, some of which I know you've been talking about here, education and skills. What should our policies be on innovation? What should our industrial policy be? And work through that with a proper stakeholder engagement through the course of September, October, so that we can get all the ideas that everybody wants to feed into that plan and work it out to 2020 or even beyond in terms of making sure that the choices we make going forward are those. David wants me to finish up, I think, now, so I will actually try and do that. The speech is on the internet, so there's some more detail there. We can't necessarily control everything that's outside our control in terms of the US, the UK and Europe. But I do think that it is important that we get our own house in order to take advantage of what we are starting to see in terms of the UK and the US recovery and various other things, so we can actually benefit most from that. I think competitiveness, labour costs are moving in the right direction. We're not there yet. I think it's sort of important that our better judgment in terms of these choices aren't just clouded over by some sort of wistful thinking, that we have to remember what the realities of our situation are and how we need to do the choices we need to do it. Last year when I came, I said that the absolute necessity for us, in terms of the one parameter that counts in terms of watching things, is the question of jobs in the economy and not having forced emigration. And I remain committed to that being one of the most important, if not the most important, indicator of success in terms of what we have. It is at least of some comfort to me, not a full comfort, to know that when we tried speaking through this last year, we were at an unemployment rate of 14.9%. We are moving in the right direction at 13.5% at this stage, and most importantly, compared to what was happening when we were in free fall, and I referred to losing 6,000 jobs a year, we have created over 20,000 jobs in the economy. So I think we're on the right path. The question is now to just continue on that path and see it out. And I look forward to hearing the other ideas from the other speakers about the rest, and I thank you for your attention.